So I grew up in a Spanish-English bilingual home in Peru. And with time, I come to realize that also my bilingual upbringing is also a product of how multilingualism has been raised, right, in my family. So from my father's side, my Slovak-speaking grandparents who immigrated to the United States did not pass on their language and heritage to their children. And from my mother's side, I have a Quechua-speaking grandfather from the Cusco region, and that's the southern Peruvian Andes. And Quechua is one of the 48 indigenous languages spoken in Peru, and you can see a linguistic map also on the slide. And Quechua also didn't become part of my mother's upbringing, right, and my own multilingual socialization. And this, in fact, represents, right, the many different ways in which coloniality continues to function across generations with regards to language diversity. Through my studies, my college education, my graduate studies, I became a participant in different ways of intercultural bilingual education programs. So maybe some of you are familiar. Intercultural bilingual education, it has been a national policy since the 1970s in the Peruvian educational system, and it seeks to incorporate indigenous languages and knowledges into the educational system. It is targeted at children and youth who are speakers of an indigenous language or who belong to one of Peru's 55 indigenous peoples. And it's also important to recognize that even though it's been taken up by government policy since the 70s up until nowadays, it actually is the outcome of grassroots mobilizations and also the struggles of indigenous movements to transform the educational system. So in my experience, I started as an ethnographer in a primary school, the bottom top picture in the region of Cusco, and that was back in 2009. I also did some work in the Quechua, Northern Peruvian Amazon schools. And later on for my dissertation work, I was interested in looking what happens in urbanized contexts, because one of the perhaps the limitations or areas that intercultural bilingual education is seeking to advance is to urbanized contexts, right? So not only focus on students in rural communities and to speakers of indigenous language as a first language or as their main language of home socialization, but also engage with a wider diversity of student profiles like we find in many urbanized areas. And through this work, I also come to be involved in higher education. And since 2018, up until last year, I was a teacher educator at an intercultural bilingual education program that was located in Lima, the capital of Peru, Lima City. And in the last 10 years, more or less, we've really seen a growth of these programs in Peru. And this is partly related to increased government spending in programs of affirmative action to support greater access to higher education from youth from underprivileged backgrounds. So this has meant a lot more indigenous students, a lot more women are joining universities to study in these programs. The students who go to these programs and who used to be my students also have very diverse speaker profiles, language learning trajectories. So we'll have students who grew up with an indigenous language as part of their home socialization. We have students who've been bilingual throughout their lives, and also students who started speaking and learning their indigenous languages at university. This teaching in these higher education programs is part of wider efforts that really have been going on and continue to go on throughout Latin America to what we call interculturalizar las universidades. And this relates to the work of Daniel Matos. He's an Argentinian scholar, educator. And here really the challenge is how do we transform these spaces, these universities, what we call universidades convencionales, conventional universities that have not been created by or for indigenous peoples, but transforming them into a space where we also bring and draw from indigenous languages, ways of knowing and knowledges, right? And one area that particularly for me, I started to engage with was rethinking research, right? At the university I used to teach a lot of research courses. So what do we mean by research? You know, who engages in research for what purpose? And here I also have to mention my students because I really learned a lot from my students in this past year. And one of the things that we really started thinking about is what do we research? right? So for example, Jessica Matapa came to me and she wanted to do her thesis, her undergraduate thesis, to be an ethnography about being a girl in Andean schools. And at the time, this was very strange, right? Because in bilingual education, we would focus more on social uses of languages, language teaching methodologies, and not really looking at issues of gender, right? So for example, this proposal that Jessica had, and then she successfully defended her dissertation, got me thinking about too, how do we engage with notions of gender, gendered identities, notions of access, and the experiences of women at this program. And also through my work with my students, we came to reflect a bit more about perhaps some of the limitations that some of the more traditional research methodologies that we were working on. We worked a lot with ethnography, presented, right? Because these were students that were also educators in the context where they were doing the research. So a bit with this background, a bit to introduce you to intercultural bilingual education, to the context where we're doing this work, I started developing these two questions that really guide the project I'm going to share and the project we're working on with Pia. So on the one hand, it's asking, right, what are the experiences of young women university students who engage in language reclamation in these spaces? And at the same time, and I see these questions as related really, how can we do collaborative research that engages with participants' individual and collective ways of knowing, of being, of relating? And I also want to share a bit of my, I guess, like academic genealogy, right? Or the people who've informed the work that I'm doing, the people that I think with together for this project. And some of you might be already familiar with this. I'm just going to go over it a bit fast. But when thinking about language reclamation, we're thinking not just of those revitalization initiatives that seek to increase uses or users of a language, right? But we're engaging with it in another sense, like many scholars that I have here have brought up. We're thinking about issues of voice. We're thinking about community empowerment, well-being as well, how communities and individuals choose to reclaim their languages and their own understandings of language. And this has been seen in North American scholarship, but also in the South, in Peru. Marina Arratia and Vicente Limachi, in Bolivia. And here we're also working with the notions of a Southern sociolinguistics, right? And then with meeting Pia, and I hope Pia agrees with this picture I have here, also thinking about how can we bring in this lens of the new speakers, right? So this lens, which developed in Europe, seeks to bring our attention to the experiences of those speakers that didn't perhaps grow up with home or community exposure, right, to minority language, but who then come to learn this language as adults, perhaps in revitalization projects and educational settings. And they have perhaps certain particular burdens that they experience, certain needs and demands that are different from youth and students who grew up with an indigenous language or who learn it as an additional, as a second, as a foreign language. So this is something too that we're thinking alongside with. From the more methodological question that I'm also bringing into this project, I'm very much inspired by the work of many decolonial scholars, particularly women scholars, indigenous women scholars like Bagel Chilisa, with her work on indigenizing methodologies, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, Maori scholar who's since 20 years or more ago brings her attention to how can we decolonize our methodologies, and really going back to this question, right, of what counts as research, who gets to engage in research, and for what purpose. In my time in Peru, I've also engaged and added, I guess, to my research repertoire some of our own Latin American traditions with participatory research. And here we also have the work of Fals Borda. He's a Colombian sociologist who worked and introduced this notion of investigación, acción participativa, right? So participatory action research. And he really invited us to think about what's the social purpose of research, right? Research to transform society, thinking about praxis. And he also has this concept of senti pensamiento, sentir pensar, this feeling and thinking, right? So how can we think from the heart, from the mind, how can we merge, right? The more rational, the more emotional ways of engaging with reality and transforming reality in a research practice. This has, of course, been taken up by many scholars in Latin America. One, which I really appreciate in her work, Rosana Mendoza has worked with ambient youth. And also they invite us to consider how can we engage with this type of participatory research that engages with ambient ways of knowing, of being, but also can incorporate other elements from other research traditions. And finally, and this is not necessarily researchers, but I also think their ideas and practice nurture and influence the way we come to engage in this research is the work of also Indigenous women and Indigenous feminist women. So we have, for example, the contributions of Lorena Cabnal. She's a Guatemalan Indigenous feminist. She introduces a notion of feminismos comunitarios, communal feminisms, and always in the plural, right? So she talks about it's always this diversity, right? There's not just one way of being a feminist. It's in rejection in a way to white feminisms, right? To show this, that there's many ways in which we experience being women and some ways which get invisibilized by more traditional or hegemonic ways of engaging with feminism. And she also brings this notion of sentir and pensar that I was telling you about Pals Borda, but from a very different tradition, right? And lastly, I also have ONAMIAP. ONAMIAP is a Peruvian-based organization. It's the National Organization of Indigenous, Andean, and Amazonian Women in English. And in their work, they've been very vocal too about understanding the diversity within the term indigenous, right? And that many times we overlook issues of gender and the diversity from within, right? So it's interesting that it's an alliance that also works with Andean and Amazonian women. So now I'm gonna focus on the meat of the presentation, and I'm gonna talk more about our journey. Now that you've come to learn a bit about where from and how do I engage in this work. I'm going to talk about the initial stages of how me and my students would come to imagine, plan, and design this project. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the workshops, which is how we developed the project. And then I'm going to share some of our ideas of how we've shared back what we've learned and how are we going to move forward. So let's look at the first stage. And this first stage of imagining the project and designing the project really took place November, December, and January of this year. So first I want to introduce Angelica Choque. So Angelica is my first research partner. I reached out to Angelica. She was my former student at the university. I advised her thesis. She's a preschool, intercultural, bilingual Quechua educator from the region of Puno of Peru. And Angelica, during the pandemic, when everything went virtual, right, higher education too, she was an acompañante of the program. And by acompañante, maybe we can think of a mentor, a counselor. So all of us teachers would have our classes on WhatsApp, on Zoom, on different platforms. But the acompañantes, they were our partners. They were the only ones that actually got to meet students in person, right? So they would travel all across Peru because our students are based in different regions. And they would offer one-to-one academic, but also emotional support. So in our conversations, Angelica was telling me that she was interested in the topic I was proposing to look at issues of gender in the program. But she also mentioned something she noticed that students were desiring, and it was also lacking, were opportunities for them to come together, right? And in our program, more than 100 students began the studies during the pandemic. So they never had any opportunity to come together and connect. So in these conversations with Angelica, we start thinking, okay, what might be the best methodological approach for this type of work? And here again, we drew on a method that's very common in Peru and different parts of Latin America. That's called el diagnóstico participativo. In English, I'm calling it participatory mapping. And this is a methodology that with origins since the 1980s in places like India and the African continent, and also inspired by Educación Popular, Paulo Freire. And the idea was to have a collective learning experience that would be led by a team of facilitators like myself and Angelica. and other students who would be interested in this role, with two goals. And this is really at the key of what participatory mapping is. The first one was to identify, to get to know, and to share our experiences as women learning and strengthening our indigenous languages. And this has to do with the fact that in participatory mapping, it is the community itself, however it is designed, that investigates, that produces knowledge, that generates data to reflect about their own situation. And the second goal was we wanted to propose a participatory mapping to identify alternatives and proposals that support our individual and collective goals of linguistic and cultural strengthening, right? So here again, in participatory mapping, the second important component, we not only learn about our own reality and reflect upon it, but then we act upon it, right? So that's the purpose of doing this participatory mapping. We also selected this methodology because it was one we teach at the teacher education program, one that our students will be familiar with. Our next step, we actually hosted what we call like an advisory committee. We hosted a meeting on Zoom, and we invited former graduates of the program. We invited the coordinator. We invited educators, both indigenous and non-indigenous educators, to participate, and we shared our initial ideas, right? This is what we're thinking of doing. And it was important too, because we wanted these to be able to contribute in some way to these programs, right? And then with their contributions, our ongoing reflections, we started to reflect on what are some of the principles that guide this project, right? One of the first ones we identified was that it would be participatory. And here, not participatory in the sense that everyone would have the same role or participate in every stage of the project in the same way. But really, we drew more on this notion of educación comunitaria, community-based education, where you participate depending on your interest, but also your abilities, right? And that would be shifting across time. We decided we wanted to center Andean ways of knowing, of doing, that it would be important to have a diverse group, and not only include different speakers of different indigenous languages, but also to represent the diversity of speaker profiles, right, that I was telling you guys about. We wanted it to be flexible, and this was really, in a way, non-negotiable and very like straightforward because of the pandemic. We had never done research in these conditions. We didn't know what it would be like. So this was something we had to commit to. We wanted the research to be beneficial to especially starting to those who participate in the research experience, and also for us to be reflexive throughout the process. I want to show you maybe some more concrete ways in which these principles apply to the work that we were doing. This is the first flyer that we developed to recruit and invite the students to participate in the project. And I remember at the time, Angelica and I questioning ourselves, will we even get one participant? And some of the ways in which it changed as we were reflecting and sharing with others was the fact, and you can see in the top part, we had first thought of just inviting the Quechua learners and speakers of the university to join, but then we identified that would be exclusive, right? We would also need to invite the Aimara speaking students, and these are two different indigenous languages from the Andes. We also, in conversations with our advisory committee, realized we would not only want to include perhaps those that fit the new speaker profile in the way I had described, but also many of them said, even those who consider themselves native speakers, when getting to university, there were many different demands and ways in which they had to use their indigenous languages, and it was also important for us to learn about and to share. So we expanded not only to invite those who were learning their indigenous language in university, but also those who were strengthening their indigenous languages. We also incorporated the idea of inviting different guests to participate in the workshops we would host, with the idea that also knowledge is co-created and shared. And it would be important to have different generational experiences, even though they were not necessarily students, but they could share their experiences with the students. And lastly, we decided to a bit tweak our invitation for the co-researchers. So we wanted to make sure we invited students who were interested in co-researching with us, but we had to really specify what type of research we wanted to do, right? So then in our final flyer, which was the one that went out, we included, would you like to be part of research that contributes to the strengthening of linguistic and cultural identities, right? So that was the way in which it was developing. Here you can meet the co-research team that finally developed. So it was 5 of us, in addition to Angelica and myself. We also had Victoria Charca, a year 3 student at the time, who identifies as Quechua from the region of Cusco, Grandinina, who identifies as Aimara from the region of Puno, and Giselle Quispe, who identifies as mestizo from the region of Apurímac. And they were all actually year 3 students. We have 2 promotions, 2 groups, one year 2 and one year 3. And Grendi and Giselle understand their indigenous languages in different ways, and they did feel that when they joined university was when they started learning it, right? Versus Victoria, who had a very different trajectory. She felt it was her mother language, the one that she had grown up since birth. So this was a co-researchers team that we had. We also recruited 20 participants who would participate in the research workshops that we would host. They were students from both promociones. They were speakers and learners of Quechua, most of them, and also different varieties of Quechua with different degrees of intelligibility. And for speakers, learners of Aimara, from many different regions of Peru, really, from the north all the way to the southern part. And we decided we would host some on-site workshops and also some virtual workshops. And this had to do with the fact of where students were, the long distances to travel, but also very much because of a pandemic, right? So we gave them the choice of where they wanted to join. We crafted our own questions with the co-research team. The first one was, in which ways do students describe their languages and their ways of communicating? The second one, in which ways being a woman shapes their educational experiences and their learning of their indigenous language. And we were looking at both community-based education and school-based education. And the third question we asked, how, where, with whom, and for what do students use and learn their indigenous languages during their college experience? And the fourth one was, what are their expectations, their actions, their demands for learning or strengthening their indigenous languages? This is a graphic representation of how the workshops, the research workshops, were organized. So we had 3 workshops that were organized around these questions. Like I was saying, they were hosted in 2 on-site locations in the Southern Peruvian Andes, and we also had an online virtual workshop for each. And you can see one was in January, February, and the last one was in March. And more or less the focus, the first one focused more on their own communicative experiences, their gender, their cultural experiences. The second workshop, we took more time to reflect about their university-based experiences and aspirations. And in the third workshop, we were thinking about how are we to share what we've learned, right? What types of actions do we want to take? And throughout and ongoingly, once we finish the workshops, we will also start interviewing those who participated in the workshops and do more analysis of the university policy, as well as some curricular mapping. Here you can see both locations of the on-site workshops and the virtual workshop we carried out in Zoom or in Google Meet sometimes. And I was sharing at the beginning the different principles that for us guided our work, and I won't read everything, you can take a look, but what I wanted to point out that this was ongoingly reflected, talked about among us, right? So we started talking with the wider research team, what would be important for us to center in these research experiences. So for example, some were like learning by doing, experience, concrete experiences, not only abstract ones. And these are all in the words of the students, to also allow spaces to account for how students and participants feel, spirituality, bilingual participation, sharing among all, learning to listen, that everyone feels included, right? So these are the principles that continue evolving in how we're designing and thinking about the workshops. Now I will talk a little bit about the workshops themselves. And here's something that we learned as this process continued. Initially, we called the workshops, and you will see it in the flyer, so this is a Quechua word that can mean a sort of gathering, right? A coming together for a specific purpose. But as they continued, Victoria was very observant to mention these have become not only a Huñinacui, but a Tincuy. And the Tincuy, also another Quechua word, has a connotation not only of gathering or coming together, but of exchanging, right? And exchanging across difference as well. And some of the ways, I will share some brief examples of what are some of the ways methodologically that I think we were creating these spaces for this type of exchanges, right? The first way, and like Pia was saying, we experimented a lot with multimodal methods, what we call lenguajes expresivos, diverse ways of expressing oneself, and also with collective participation frameworks. And here the idea was to decenter speech, right, as the main or as the only way in which communication could happen. We worked with language portraits, which I'm sure you guys are very well familiar with. And this is the prompt that we gave. So we found it was very important to be very clear, have also an accessible language to share a prompt. The participants had time to draw their language portraits when you chose to do it in groups. And then we would share, right? We would have a talking circle and they would share their language portraits. And just to give you a bit of examples of this diversity of the participant profiles that we had students, for example, like Talia here, who identified Aimara as a second language, one she hadn't grown up with, one that she was just beginning to learn in university. We can see, if you can see at the bottom part, the happy face and the sad face. And for them, both of these coexisted, right? This notion of ambivalence, of contradictions to her own experience, of frustrations, right? Of how it felt to be a learner. And she described it as becoming a learner too late in life, right? And what that meant for her at the university. And also it caught her attention. She has a book, right? You can see on the other side of the drawing. And for her, it's interesting, her indigenous language is not orally very much part of her experience, but it's more in print, in the writing, that she comes to learn and use this language. And then we have other students here, like Daisy, who identified Quechua as her mother language, which she used alongside Spanish. She said without difficulty in many different contexts, in many different contexts, with many different actors. She even included her knowledge and use of sign languages. And something that also caught our attention right from the beginning, and can you see the right corner, we see a mountain, the trees, the river, was how they also represented ways of communicating important to them, communication with non-human actors, right? And this was seen across many language portraits. Here we have another one by Jessica. We also have the coca leaves, the sacred coca leaves used, also in ceremonial, spiritual practices, La Chicha de Jora. We have communication with the sun, the stars, the moon, learning how to observe and also pay one's respect to different non-human actors. So here you can start thinking how also they think of notions of language reclamation, right? And the different notions of language that are part of this experience. And what we began to see, and this is part of the surveys we did after each one of the workshops, was that the participants were really sharing that being able to draw and represent in this modality allowed them to express themselves in ways that perhaps they could not have done it alone with words, right? Another way we worked also in the workshops was with artifacts, objects. We had in another activity a prompt that asked them to bring an object that for them represented what it meant to be a woman in your family, in your community, in your territory. And they really brought a range of different objects. We have an aguayo, an Aimara aguayo textile that can be used to transport many different things, but also to carry babies. Some medicinal plants. And here Leonela brought one of them, cedroncillo, and then some cleaning gloves, and many of you might be familiar, right? So here the idea was for the students to be able to share What are the different gender roles that they see in their everyday lives, in their families, but also have these conversations, about how they position themselves, if they identify themselves with these objects or not. And also we talk a lot about the changes across time and across generations. And I will share one more example. I think this is a very nice example of, I guess, the opportunities that working with objects, material objects, also brings and allows us to hear language reclamation experiences in different ways than just speech. This is Milagros, who brought a red pollera. A pollera is a traditional skirt worn in many parts of the Andes by women. This is a red one made of sheep's wool given to her by her grandmother. And as Milagros held the pollera and was sharing with all of us what this meant, she was thinking back about her own socialization. She grew up speaking Spanish. She grew up hearing Quechua, which was spoken by her father, and some Aymara phrases and words spoken by her mother. And when she's sharing this story and looking at her pollera, she starts to reflect about what her father used to tell her, right? And her father didn't want Milagros nor her siblings, especially her sisters, to learn neither Aymara or Quechua, and used to say things like, she won't be able to speak languages, and they will call her a chola. On top of that, she's dark-skinned, right? And in these conversations, Milagros was really telling us, what's at stake for a woman of her age and where she grew up to become a speaker, to grow up as a speaker of an indigenous language. There is the sense of when he says she won't be able to speak languages, that she will speak a non-standard variety of Spanish, for which she will be racialized, and also the stakes for her as a woman, right? If we think about colonial hierarchies, with indigenous women in many ways at the bottom of this colonial hierarchy, this will play against her. She also becomes a speaker of an indigenous language. And in addition to that, she will be racialized in particular ways because of her darker skin color, right? And then Milagros continues sharing with this object that she's bringing and talks about how at university it's a big turning point, right? For her to reclaim, she has this opportunity to learn to speak Aymara. And she has many reasons, that she starts becoming interested in speaking Aymara. But one of them that really was important to her, and you could tell it in how her voice sounded at the time, her facial expressions too. And it's a way also to honor her mother, right? Who's an indigenous trilingual woman who wears actually a pollera. And she says she wants to be trilingual like her mom. For her, it sounds nice, like an empowered woman. And she also recognizes not only her multilingual self of her mother, but also all the knowledges that she has, right? And this is something that was important for her in her own process of reclaiming her indigenous language, Aymara. And this example that I give with Milagros, I think it's a nice one because it really shows in a way like the embodied experiences of language reclamation, right? How she remembers, how she experiences it, but not only in an individual way, but also a collective way, right? How it relates to their own experience and life trajectory of her mother. And well, finally, going back to the talking circles that I had shared, right? The fact that we were able to do this and share these together really allowed for this sense of how this knowledge about women's experiences is really co-constructed, right? And co-emerges during this process. And here the focus was not necessarily on what data we would produce for this academic audience that was not necessarily present there at the time, but really how meaningful it is for those who are present at the moment, right? For it to be a significant experience for them. And well, then we have a quote for one of our students, and this is only in field notes, we still have a lot to transcribe, of what it meant for them to learn from each other, right, among each other, and all the lessons that she's taking to strengthen her own Quechua, and that she's very thankful, for all the other participants for that which they have shared, right? And in this experience, we have students who identify how healing it can be to hear someone else also shares your experience, and also some who hear very different experiences from their own, but that also helps to bring awareness, to create empathy, because they're all peers in the same program. The second way in which our workshops developed, and something that was really present from the beginning of the experience, was how would we promote multilingual participation, but also the use of indigenous languages, right? What we're calling Simichispunan here in Quechua. And at the beginning, us, the research team, we really, we had proposed and we had decided we wanted to promote a free participation, that anyone could participate in any language or languages that they wanted. But we were aware, you know, that perhaps there would be some challenges, or how would we engage with this, because it was a very diverse group, right? We had speakers of 2 different indigenous languages and different varieties of these languages as well. And after the first workshop, we actually realized that perhaps our intentions to promote this free use of languages resulted in the absence of indigenous language use, right? So we heard mostly Spanish being used by our different participants, and even a bit of sense of anxiety, insecurity from some. So Talia actually asked during the workshops, you know, teacher, do I have to speak in my indigenous language? And she was feeling uncomfortable because it's something she didn't feel she could do at the time. So this led us to come back together as a research team and really like look inward, right? I had my own questions if I was perhaps imposing my own views of what I thought would be centering of indigenous knowledges and languages. You know, was I trying to impose that they use their indigenous languages even if they didn't feel comfortable, didn't want to? Giselle and Grendi, and this is also coming from their own histories, said they felt a lot of frustration, you know, being co-facilitators of this experience, but that they didn't feel they had enough language abilities to be able to co-lead this process in a bilingual way. Victoria, who was more comfortable with Quechua, said that it was actually hard, a little bit hard for her to use the language when others in the group wouldn't understand. And it involved more labor to interpret, to make oneself understood. And it was something not always, and because of the topics we were talking about, not always easy to translate or interpret, right? And finally, Angelica brought up this other point, that she wasn't really used to using her indigenous language with her peers. It was more that she used at classrooms in university or at her job, right? But she didn't feel there was a sense of trust, confianza. So we had this discussion if we were, in a way, trying to privilege languages over language users, and really thinking about how can we promote multilingualism, but also take into account the different trajectories of all of our participants. So what did we do? We decided to have this conversation, to share our own insecurities, our own frustrations, our own questions with our participants. So we had this activity called confessions, because it very much felt in a way that they were sharing something that they were afraid to share, right? And they said that this that happened in the workshops was actually reflective of wider dynamics that happened at university, right? Where indigenous language use stays more within classrooms, within like obligatory assignments given by teachers, but there's very little opportunity for use among themselves, right? So we feel, you know, actually being able to talk about these insecurities, being able to talk about how notions of authenticity, of purity played against them, really helped to open a space where then they felt comfortable using their indigenous languages in different ways. So we decided, you know, we would make our own spaces in the ways in which they emerged. From our end as facilitators, we realized we shouldn't put much of a burden on individual facilitators to make use of languages in a certain way, but it could be more of a collective experience. We could draw on all of our communicative resources to facilitate the activities and promote indigenous language use. And also we decided, you know, to also give that same opportunity for the participants. And when we changed this, I guess, mindset, we started to also recognize the ways in which they were drawing on their indigenous languages to engage in getting to know one another and sharing experiences. For example, in the bus ride, to different places across that they travel to go to the workshops or workshop activities during meal times, in some of the communal activities we participated on during the workshops, in some of the ceremonies we did, and also with some of our guests And the last picture is a picture of social media activists, Solistra. And they really appreciated, that there was an authentic purpose and reason for communicating in Quechua. And I also wanted to show one other example that perhaps we had overlooked. We had decided to promote oral language use because of the many, how can we call it? The different tensions sometimes that exist about writing in indigenous languages because of issues of standardization. But actually for participants, writing was a way in which they felt safe, right? So this is an activity where they each wrote their own goals of how they wanted to move forward with their process of language reclamation. And they had short-term, long-term goals, what were some of their weaknesses, what were actions they wanted to take. And they had here in the center a phrase, a motivation that they felt would help them, achieve those goals. And many chose to do it, right? In their indigenous languages, we have Kakahina Tila, and this refers to the strength, to the resistance of a rock, really. And others even decided, right, to write different parts of it and also to share this in the group in their indigenous languages. And one very, I think, telling case is the one of Leonela, who she identifies as a new speaker that struggles a lot, has struggled a lot with learning, speaking Quechua. And it was also important for her. She also wrote the phrase, Cacapas Casa, I will be like the rock, very similar to the previous participant. And this was something that she could do because of the collective nature of the activity. So they had all drawn together, even though it was individual work. And she had been talking to her peers, learning about them, how can I say this? How can I write this? So I think that also helped, right? That there was spaces for collective language learning and language use, which also happened in another activity where we have also an activity of collective song making. And here what was really nice was how, and you can see it in the parentheses, they drew on the different varieties of the indigenous languages that were present in this group to write and then perform a song of what it meant for them to be Quechua and Aimara women, right? And perhaps even if there wasn't as much language use in the workshop as we had originally imagined, what we noticed here, and they also said they appreciated, there was this opportunity to learn across diversity and across different varieties that many times in the university program was not present because they're separated by different language courses. I think if I finish in 10 minutes, that will be good. Yeah, okay, thank you. And the last part that was also important in the workshop was the ways in which traditional knowledges were also centered, right, in different ways. And this was actually something that surprised us, I think, the most, and that we've shared in our reflections, and really helped us to see language reclamation from the perspective of the participants, that it's not only about languages, but it's also about cultural knowledges and knowledge systems. And this is something that started thanks to Angelica. We were brainstorming ideas of what types of icebreakers perhaps we could include in the workshops for participants to get to know one another. And she introduced this set of cards called Mamarupu. Mamarupu in Quechua is abuela, grandmother. And it's a set of cards called the Amazonian Oracle. And it's a set of cards that includes knowledge gathered with elders from the Quechua, Shipibo, Cucama, Cucamiri, and Shawi, indigenous people in Peru. And she brought it as an idea, of an icebreaker we can do. You have a graphic representation of the knowledge, el saber, that's represented. In this case, is the coca leaf. And then the way they've done it, you have a description, right, of this traditional knowledge. And then you have some suggested activities you can do, right? And the idea is to help you reflect on your own situation, process you're in, life even. So then what happened is I was I have to admit, a bit skeptical at the beginning, and I was thinking to myself, like, is this research? Like, how we do this? And then we said, okay, let's do it. I knew I had to suspend my judgment. This is an initiative Angelica's bringing. We're going to do it. And actually, it was very amazing when we had this moment, right? Angelica, she led it. We all gathered in a circle, and she placed the different cards, and each person had to select one card, right? And share the reflection that they took. And as we were sharing, it was amazing to hear, to recognize the vast knowledges that all the group had together, right? And these are also collective knowledges that have been passed on to the students by their mothers, their grandmothers, their grandparents, different family members and elders. And it really created a space for us to really get to know each other on a deeper way. We sensed it, we not necessarily just think about it, but this was not the right moment to record, right? To take pictures, we just have of the cards, not of the whole process. And after we finish, Angelica comes to me and she's like, teacher, are we allowed to use this for our research, right? So then goes back to like even our own internalized idea of what counts as research, right? What counts as data. And again, talking about it with the whole group, we realized that there was this wide range of knowledges related to agriculture, health, medicinal plants, childbearing, related to how to engage with climate change, etc., that were also important to be part of these experiences. To the point that one of the last activities we had, the students made their own cards, drawing on their own community knowledges, local knowledges, to share with the whole group. I will just go over this, but also engaging with spirituality and spiritual practices. But this has to be done in respectful ways, in ways that don't assume one already knows something about that, or there is only one way to engage with this or do it. And also, well, here are some other examples of traditional knowledges that were part of the program, of the workshop, sorry. So the main point really being that it helped us to think of how they view their own process of language and cultural reclamation, and also to recognize their own knowledges that they have, right, that they already have, and to recognize the diversity within the student group. This is the last stage of the project that we've engaged with 2 weeks ago. It was important for us, first of all, to share back all of these that we had been learning with the whole group. So we decided to host an interactive exhibit in some way, where we put up all the different sorts of materials and products and artifacts that the participants had produced for all of them to see, to interact with. And remember, there were different workshops, not all in the same location. So for many, it was the first time they were coming together and seeing what had been produced by their peers. They even had a chance to listen to some of the testimonies of the students who participated in the virtual workshops. And this sharing back was guided, had two important lessons for us. One of the reasons we also did it was we wanted to make sure that that which we were learning during this experience was something that the students felt really represented themselves. So we asked them after, we also had, and here you can see Giselle, we had a short PowerPoint presentation where we shared back that which we felt we had learned from this experience, responding to our research questions. And we asked them, for example, do you feel represented? What are we missing? What should we add, right? And this led to a very interesting conversation and discussion, specifically some of the students offering their own experiences that they had shared and were not necessarily put into this presentation. And one of the ones that really touched us was one that Ada shared. And Ada said that she had always been proud of her indigenous language. And this was a good reminder also that we should not just focus perhaps on the difficulties, oppressions, marginalizations that were part of students' experiences, but this also has to go hand in hand with notions of resistance, of pride, of the ways in which they do engage, right, in different linguistic and cultural practices that they feel proud of. We also brainstormed what of our data we wanted to share and with which stakeholders, including students, local authorities, university teachers, students, families, etc., and different actions that would be born out of this project. And this is something that's in the next stage, right, of the process now that we finished the workshops, and we hope to continue. So now and here I will finish, and this goes back to the first two questions I shared at the beginning. What have we been learning, right, about these two questions? And how do we envision moving forward with this project? So for the first one, that has to do with the experiences of young women university students in language reclamation, I think one of the main important things we've learned is just to recognize the diversity of who are these students, right? And this was an exercise we did together with our co-research team. And even though we had begun by thinking of them as Aimara, as Quechua students, they really have a diversity of identities and positionalities that shape men in many different ways, sometimes in similar ways, sometimes in different ways, sometimes in contradictory ways, what it means for them to reclaim, to learn their languages, right? Not only are they Aimara, Quechua, mestizo students, and they were very empathetic in not adopting the term indigenous, too, something we had assumed at the beginning. But they are also older siblings, they are daughters, they are nieces, granddaughters, they are also friends, they are peers, they have different personalities, different physical traits, different lived experiences across rural and urban contexts. They have different schooling experiences that also have shaped their language learning trajectories. They have very different proficiencies in their indigenous languages, different migratory patterns. They are university students, you know, and that has different opportunities and constraints for their language learning trajectories. And they also identified economic status that also matter, right? So this helps us think about the intersectionality, right, of the multiple identities, and not only like those macro social categories, but really like these more bottom-up, meaningful identities, identities that are meaningful to them at these stages of their life. So with the things we've been learning about this first question, we think we can draw from and also contribute to the work on new speakers, on language reclamation, right? To continue thinking about what counts as language reclamation from how they experience it, to look at both individual and collective trajectories, to look at embodied experiences, to look at how gender, right? How it's also language reclamation, a gendered experience that impacts who has access and what types of access to what language resources, impacts one's motivations. It is intersectional, as I was saying, and it is an experience where both the different violences women experience coexist with what Lorena Camnal calls emancipaciones, right? Relating to this notion about desire-centered frameworks for understanding their experiences. We want to also share, you know, how universities and the university experience can also be a turning point in one's language learning trajectory. And the last bit I want to share, and this has more to do with our collaborative research methodologies. I think we are in conversation and can also contribute to current work on the Colonial and Southern sociolinguistics, multilingual studies. And here what we found important was making room and centering individual and collective ways of knowing, of learning, of languaging, of relating, but doing it in non-essentialist ways, right? And this was important because of the diversity of our group, right? And also moving away from more notions of traditional and authentic that doesn't stem from their lived experiences, right? For this type of work, we also have learned that it's very important to have these ongoing and deliberate reflections of how do we do this in research, recognizing many times there are tensions that will arise and challenges, but it is by addressing those tensions and challenges that we can open up the spaces. We have found that it can be very meaningful to conduct research that has a direct significance or purpose for those who participate in the research experience. And that this also comes down to, at the end, relationships. You know, how do we sustain, how do we create relationships, how do we cultivate relationships across the research process in ways, at least that in my experience with more ethnographic methods, it transcends many of the ways in which we engage and relate to our research participants and involves a lot of care in sustaining these relationships. So this is it. This is the talk. Urpillay son Koyay, Quechua, Paisuma, and Aimara, gracias. to you who are present here, to our colleagues in Zoom. I want to finish again by acknowledging the contributions of my co-researchers, Angelica, Victoria Charca, Grandinina, Giselle Quispe, all of our participants, also acknowledging our funders of this project, and finishing with a picture of our participants as they leave one of the workshops and look forward ahead to all that will come. Thank you very much.